In 1987, Super Mario Bros. Was the biggest game in the world. It was a system seller for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it was a definitive title that made Nintendo a household name. Simply put, it defined what a platformer could be: smooth horizontal scrolling, precise physics, and an incredible sense of momentum. But in Europe, and particularly in Germany, the Commodore 64 was king. In countries like Germany, France, and the UK, the NES had negligible market penetration. These were considered computer markets and not console markets. The game would be so influential that publishers realized there was nothing like it on home computers. And one such publisher, Rainbow Arts from Germany, decided to do something about it. They would task themselves to build the ultimate horizontal platforming game that resembled Super Mario Bros. On the Commodore 64, and it took them just 7 months. That game would be known as the Great Giana Sisters. Mark Ulrich was the CEO of Rainbow Arts, approached Nintendo about doing an official Super Mario Bros. Port for home computers. Nintendo would say no. So Ulrich did what any publisher would do in 1987. He told his developers to go ahead and make their own version. The developers, known as Time Warp, were a small team of just 3 people comprised of Armin Gassay, Manfred Trenz, and composer Chris Hűlsbeck. They were given the task to bring a game like Super Mario Bros. To home computers for the very first time. This would be a very smart move. A smooth scrolling horizontal platformer wasn't very common on the Commodore 64 at the time. In fact, most platforming games were comprised of single screens, such as Impossible Mission and Jumpman. There was nothing really else on the market at the time that had that fluid left-to-right momentum that Super Mario Bros. Had. It was simply the gold standard. The NES PPU was built for tile-based scrolling games. Now, of course, the Commodore 64's VIC-2 chip could do smooth scrolling. It still would require careful programming and assembly optimizations. The horizontal scroll registers of the VIC-2 only give you 3 bits of fine scroll from 0 to 7, before you have to shift the entire screen in memory. In short, getting a Mario-quality horizontal scrolling mechanism running on the C64 was a serious technical challenge, but the German trio of Time Warp were up to the task. Mark Ulrich told his developers, "Make something immediately recognizable as Super Mario Bros., but legally distinct enough to avoid trouble with Nintendo." The sprites found in Super Mario Bros. Were changed into owls and disembodied eyes, wasps and giant ants. Instead of Mario growing larger with a power-up, the main character, Giana, transforms with spiky hair. It was a technical decision as much as a creative one. A different sprite than a scaled sprite would avoid direct comparison. And then there was the name. Of course, they couldn't use Super Mario Bros., so they would change Super to Great, Mario would become Giana, and Brothers would become Sisters. The game took about 7 months to develop, and technically it was impressive for the Commodore 64. The smooth scrolling would be the standout. It was very fluid, and it proved that the Commodore 64 was capable of running a Super Mario Bros. Style game. The game comes featured with 33 levels, and some of them are near copies of Mario's early stages. I mean, if you take a look at World 1-1, it's basically the same map just with different tiles. But eventually, the game would gradually diverge from the original blueprint with its own identity. The Great Giana Sisters would ship in 1987, releasing in Germany and then later internationally. The C64 version was the first release, with ports to the Amiga and Atari ST. The game would review well. Zap64 in the UK would rate it 96% and it would receive the coveted Gold Medal award. In Germany, it sold very well for several months. While the game would be a blatant rip-off of Super Mario Bros., Chris Hűlsbeck's soundtrack was untouchable. The theme music would become one of the most iconic pieces of SID music ever composed, and it's even been performed by symphony orchestras. It's been remixed hundreds of times, and it's an absolute classic. For the first few months of sales, things seemed to be progressing nicely, and according to some reports, a sequel was already in development. But it wouldn't be long before some red flags started to appear. The sub-brand of US Gold that handled the UK distribution put a tagline on the box that said, "The brothers are history." According to various reports, Nintendo were not pleased. Now, there is a big myth around this story to suggest that Nintendo legally sued and won, removing all copies of the game from store shelves. But the exact legal details have never been made fully public. But there was never any formal lawsuits filed. But what is clear is that Nintendo would contact Rainbow Arts and made their position extremely clear, and the game would be pulled from sale. Other ports in development, such as the ZX Spectrum, was cancelled entirely. The Amstrad CPC port was officially completed, but it was never released. In less than 12 months, Nintendo had removed the Great Giana Sisters from store shelves. But here's the thing, the game was on shelves long enough to get into the wild, and in Europe, piracy ruled the home computer scene. The game would spread like wildfire through copied discs and bulletin boards. And because the game was removed from store shelves, it became one of the most desirable C64 games in existence. Original box copies became collector's items worth hundreds of dollars. So the C64 got its Super Mario Bros., albeit briefly, before Nintendo stepped in and took down the whole thing. But this is not the end of the story. 32 years after the Great Giana Sisters was pulled from shelves, a developer by the name of Zero Page would release Super Mario Bros. 64. And this wasn't a clone or an homage. This was a direct one-to-one port of Super Mario Bros. Running on the Commodore 64. We have to remember that both the NES and C64 use variants of the same MOS 6502 processor. The NES runs a Rico 2A03, which is a modified 6502 which is clocked at 1.79 MHz, and the C64 runs a 6510, which is also a 6502 variant that runs at 0.985 MHz for PAL and just over a megahertz for NTSC. So what we're saying is that the NES CPU is approximately 70% faster than the C64 CPU, and this clock speed deficit is a massive challenge when you're trying to port the game and having it run at the same game logic. But Zero Page had a few tricks up his sleeve. This would not be a clean room implementation. In fact, the actual NES code was disassembled and adapted to run on the C64 hardware. Zero Page would rewrite all the I/O, graphics and sound routines to target the C64's VIC-2 and SID chips instead of the NES PPU and APU, but the core game logic would be the original code. This is why every single bug, every glitch and every quirk of the NES version is present in the C64 version. The port also takes advantage of full-screen smooth scrolling, and this was done by a technique called VSP or variable screen positioning. This is effectively an exploit of the VIC-2 chip. It's possible to manipulate the VIC-2's memory mapping at a precise cycle during the raster scan to make it read screen data from a different address. This means it's possible to have full-screen smooth scrolling without having to copy screen memory. This is not a documented feature, and it's extremely timing sensitive down to individual clock cycles. Some C64 motherboards simply cannot run this feature, while many other revisions handle it fine. Zero Page's documentation actually recommends trying a different C64 if you experience crashing. And if you're someone that has a Commodore 64 Ultimate, it is designed to be VSP safe. The conversion of the sound engine to the C64 SID chip is equally clever. Recall that the NES has 5 separate channels, 2 pulse waves, a triangle, a noise channel, and a delta modulation channel. The SID chip has just 3 voices. Zero Page would map the NES's 2 pulse channels and triangle to the 3 SID voices, and timeshare 1 voice between the triangle and the noise channel. But what's clever is that the port will detect if you have a dual SID setup, and it will distribute the 2 APU channels per SID for better audio separation. We also said that the NES runs some 70% faster than the Commodore 64, so Zero Page would implement turbo detection. The port automatically detects if you're running a Commodore 128 in 2 MHz mode, a C64 DTV, a Turbo Chameleon, a Super C64 accelerator, and various other turbo boards. You can still run the game on a stock C64, but there are occasional slowdowns, indicated by a pixel on the timer display, but the game is fully playable. With a turbo-enhanced Commodore 64, it's almost impossible to detect any differences between the original NES game. Just like the Great Giana Sisters, Nintendo was not thrilled, and issued a DMCA takedown almost immediately. The download links for the game were pulled within days. Of course, this is Nintendo we're talking about, originally threatening Rainbow Arts over a game that merely looked like Super Mario Bros., to taking down a port that was actually Super Mario Bros. Some 32 years later. And it seems like a massive overreach for this kind of work. I mean, the C64 port could never really be seen as direct competition for any ongoing business, but here we are. But ultimately, there's some type of symmetry to all this. In 1987, European C64 owners wanted Super Mario Bros. So bad that a German publisher commissioned a clone, which was a fantastic game in its own right, and became infamous for being pulled off the shelves. And then fast forward to 2019, the C64 community just decided to do it themselves. They just ported the actual game. As it turns out, with enough skill and 7 years of work, a Commodore 64 could run Super Mario Bros. All along. Nintendo tried to stop both of them, but the Commodore 64 scene doesn't forget, and it doesn't stop coding. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this episode, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.